Good afternoon, everyone. We are letting participants in as we speak, and we are also waiting for one of our panelists, speakers. So as soon as we will give ourselves 2 more minutes and we will start. Thank you very much for your patience. Good afternoon, everyone. We were saying earlier that we are still waiting for one of our speakers of the first session. Thank you for your patience. We will start in the coming 2 minutes. I think we can start the proceedings. We have already, we are late by a few minutes. We have a dense agenda. Good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Warm welcome to you. Welcome to the first Fiscal Policy Forum, jointly organized by the Coalition for Dialogue on Africa and the South Center. I am Suad Aden Osman, Executive Director of CODA and the head of the Secretariat of the African Union high-level panel on illicit financial flows. On the organizers, the South Center is an intergovernmental policy research think tank composed of and accountable to developing country member states. CODA, on the other hand, is an initiative of the African Union, African Development Bank, UNECA, and Afrexim Bank. It's a platform for dialogues and debate, open, frank, inclusive dialogues and debate on matters pertaining to Africa's development. Mine today is to welcome you all to this first Fiscal Policy Forum and share some housekeeping announcements. Interpretation in English, French, and Spanish are available during this event. At the bottom of your screen, if you are using a laptop, you will find a button for interpretation. It's an image like a globe. Please select your preferred language now. If you are on a phone or a tablet, you may need to push the More button to access it. There will be a session for open discussions, allowing for questions from participants to the panelists. In order to give your question, you can use any of the following options. At any time during the forum, you can use the chat function to type in your question or comment. The second option is to use the Q&A button, which can be found at the bottom of the screen as well. The final option will only be noted during the discussion session is to use the raise your hand button, which is also at the bottom of the screen. Our team will be taking note of questions and comments in the chat as we go, as well as the hands raised, and will bring them to the attention of the moderator. We will try to cover as many questions as time allows. Finally, please keep an eye on the chat box, where the organizers will be sharing useful links, documentations relevant to the discussions or our work. With these few words, allow me to introduce our moderator, the moderator of the first session, Professor Sylvain Boko, Senior Advisor to CODA, and to the African Union High-Level Panel on Illicit Financial Flows. Professor Boko, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Swad. Excellency Dr. Zainab Shamsuna Ahmed, Honorable Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning, Federal Republic of Nigeria, Excellency Mr. Shaukat Tareen, Honorable Minister of Finance, Islamic Republic of Pakistan, Excellency Dr. Hakim Ben Hamouda, former Minister of Finance, Republic of Tunisia, and Chair of the CODA Technical Committee on Domestic Resource Mobilization, Excellency Dr. Maxwell Mkwezelamba, former Minister of Finance of Malawi and former Commissioner for Economic Affairs for the African Union, and a CODA Senior Advisor, member of the Technical Committee on Domestic Resource Mobilization. Excellency Dr. Yemi Dipeolu, Special Advisor to the President of Nigeria for Economic Matters, and alternate Chair of the CODA Technical Committee on Domestic Resource Mobilization. Dr. Carlos Maria Correa, Executive Director of the South Center, and Ms. Suad Aden Osman, Executive Director of CODA, serving as Secretariat for the High-Level Panel on Illicit Financial Flows from Africa. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this first African Fiscal Policy Forum organized by CODA and the South Center. The theme of the forum is inequalities in taxing rights. Inequalities in taxing rights. The objectives of this dialogue series, because I must mention that this is the first of a series of dialogues that are planned to take hold around this theme. And so the objectives of this dialogue series is to bring, in terms of our main objective, is to bring together key stakeholders to discuss the current global processes towards combating illicit financial flows, reallocation of taxing rights, the role of African regional institutions, the importance and place of Africa's voice and representation in these processes. The dialogue series will examine the legitimacy of these processes, including the nature of Africa's representation in the global conversations and the outcome of the processes with respect to Africa's interests. The specific objectives are the following: to interrogate the content of the two-pillar solution proposed and other solutions proposed by the inclusive framework that we received from OECD on BEPS, that's base erosion and profit shifting behaviors, and their implication for African countries. To analyze the UN FACTI panel recommendations on the same issues, to discuss the UN Tax Committee's digital tax solutions, also known as Article 12B, and to engage relevant stakeholders and discuss why countries, specifically Nigeria and Kenya, refuse to endorse the inclusive framework's two-pillar solution, and to recommend options available to African countries in that respect. We expect at the end of this series, in terms of output, the following: increased awareness on the ostracizing nature of the ongoing global processes with respect to Africa, stronger action and policies to improve the nature of Africa's representation in these global conversations and processes, and develop a roadmap for the development of a common African position on global processes, and recommendation on the reallocation of taxing rights. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the context and the background for this forum, of which this today is the first of a series, as I have mentioned. So without further ado, may I check if the Honorable Minister of Finance of the Federal Republic of Nigeria has signed on. Okay, so while we wait for the Honorable Minister to sign on and make her statement, may I ask that the statement recorded by His Excellency, Mr. Shaukat Tarin, Honorable Minister of Finance, Islamic Republic of Pakistan, be played for the audience, please. Eddie, do we have volume? We are not hearing.
express my appreciation to the fact that South Center and Coalition for Dialogue on Africa have extended the invitation to me to participate and deliver a statement on reforms of international taxation system and stemming illicit financial flows. We know that the digital companies based in developed countries could not be taxed on revenues generated by those in the developing countries because in most of the situation, the digital companies did not have fiscal footprint in the developing countries. These digital companies were not paying proper tax even in the developed countries because these companies would set up their offices in offshore tax havens. That meant that they gave rise to massive tax evasion and illicit financial flows across the border. The OECD took a lead to tackle these problems in 2015 by creating a group of countries being members of the inclusive framework on BEPS and has tried to come up with a twin solution to the matter, i.e. Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. Given the fact that OECD is a club rich countries and publicly acknowledges the fact that it promotes the interests of the developing countries. So we, as Pakistan, along with 3 other countries, we had raised our reservations simply because there is nothing in the solution for developing countries. But there is a wide resentment in the entire developing countries on the decisions taken by the OECD. I'm glad that South Center, which is an intergovernmental organization under the UN framework, is geared to assist the developing countries to protect their fiscal base and tax rights. And the illicit financial flows is at the forefront of the international agenda and is being raised by the southeast of Europe. Now, IFFs are a significant barrier to the sustainable development, and these flows strip resources that could finance much needed public services such as healthcare, education, and other vital elements of sustainable development. I believe that we, the developing countries, have to be given a chance that we can tax these large companies, on our own soil. We can basically should have, sovereignty of our, data, and that should be housed in our country. And we should also make sure all the traffic, the telephony and the data traffic should be, taxed in an appropriate manner, so that we can also spend money on our welfare of our country and the poor people of our country. So we will continue to fight this on behalf of the developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you to His Excellency, Minister of Finance of the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. The minister emphasized the importance of curbing and stemming IFFs, because this is how developing countries can finance the national priorities for their own development. The minister pointed out that the current solution being offered by the OECD inclusive framework has nothing, to use his word, for developing countries in terms of solution. And the minister finished by urging the need for developing countries to have the ability to tax the big companies, the large companies that are doing business on their territories themselves, so as to gain the maximum amount to be able to fund and finance their own development priorities. And I will thank once again for His Excellency the Minister for putting us on the path of thinking thoroughly about the implication of these issues for Africa, for the developing countries in general. And now I would like to see and check with Mr. Johnson if the Honorable Minister of Nigeria has signed in.
Professor, no, not yet. The Honorable Minister is still in that emergency meeting. She will be intervening when she joins us. I think the proceedings can continue. We will make room for her intervention, regardless of where we stand in the agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I think we have our guidance now from the Honorable Minister. We will get further guidance from the Minister from Nigeria. And I believe that this will allow us to move into the technical segment of this forum. And for that, I would like to introduce a call upon Dr. Carlos Maria Correz, the Executive Director of the South Center, to please take the floor in order to moderate the next segment. I thank you very much. Dr. Correa.
Thank you very much, Professor Boko. So let me express the great satisfaction of the South Center for being able to co-organize this very important event with CODA. We are going to deal with very important issues for African countries and other developing countries. So let me also thank our very distinguished speakers and of course all the team that has been working in order to allow this event to take place. We are going to start now the technical discussion on a fairer tax regime for Africa. This will be then initiated with a presentation by His Excellency Hakim Mahmouda, the former Minister of Finance of the Republic of Tunisia, who is currently the member of the CODA Technical Committee on Domestic Resource Mobilization. This will be followed by the intervention of 3 distinguished panelists, and then we'll have the intervention of 5 of the collaborating organizations in this event. We are also very thankful for their support to this event. And then we are going to move to an open discussion. So there will be a lot of room in order to discuss the issues which have been just raised. So let me very briefly present a few remarks in order to provide further context to the discussion we are going to have in this conference. The first one is that it is very clear that inequalities have characterized the international taxation standards so far. So there are many manifestations of these inequalities. One is the fact that tax avoidance has continued to grow, and it has been aggravated in the digital economy, and developing countries are particularly suffering from this. Secondly, corporate tax evasion still deprives governments in Africa and other developed countries from the needed resources for development in order to strengthen the health systems, in order to strengthen the education, in order to realize human rights in general, in order to invest in the needed infrastructure. It is known, and this is really a matter of concern, that despite the efforts made by tax administrations in Africa, the illicit financial flows have increased. In accordance to some estimates, there has been an increase of 77% since 2015 to 2020, when these flows have reached about 90 billion US dollars annually. And this is a matter of concern, and action needs to be taken. This has to be changed. In this regard, I would like to stress the very important work that CODA is doing. Many organizations that part of the coalitions are doing in order to address this very important problem. Also, the role that the Mbeki panels on the high-level Mbeki panel has played in highlighting the problems and proposing solutions, the role of the UN FACTI panel, ICRIC, and other organizations. So we all need to continue working together. These problems need to be addressed in a practical manner, in a manner that leads to actual solutions. It is critical, as it was already mentioned, to mobilize domestic resources in the continent, in Africa. In our view, this is the only way in which development can be pursued. Foreign direct investment, as we know, has fallen, in particular in the context of COVID-19. African countries and other developing countries cannot depend on ODA. ODA has been stagnant. The real source for development in African and other developing countries is mobilization of domestic resources. And for this is, of course, critical to have a fair taxation system, in particular one that allows our countries to tax the activities of foreign corporations, including now, more specifically in the context of the digital economy. As it was already mentioned, on October 8th of this year, an agreement was reached in the context of this inclusive framework, OECD G20 inclusive framework. And then this so-called two-pillar solution has been adopted. This agreement breaks new ground in some respects in international taxation, for instance, in relation to the consideration of multinational companies as a unitary entity, in relation to demand as a factor in profit allocation. But certainly the two-pillar solution does not address in a satisfactory manner the needs of developing countries, as already been stated by the minister, the finance minister of Pakistan. So the question is the extent to which this so-called two-pillar solution does actually provide a solution for developing countries, in particular for African countries. On October 13, the South Center issued a statement with a critical assessment of the two-pillar solution. In this statement, there is a brief analysis of the shortcomings of the solutions, including in Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. And I hope we have the opportunity to discuss during this conference these shortcomings and how to address this problem. And then initially, my request would be to really consider in a very careful manner whether they endorse or not this agreement. As it was mentioned, Nigeria and Kenya in the continent have not endorsed this agreement. It's the case of Pakistan. So it's very important to understand what are the reasons for that and what alternatives exist. And then to end with a positive note, it was already mentioned also by the finance minister of Pakistan. There has been an important development this year with the adoption of Article 12B by the UN Tax Committee, which provides a simple formulation that may benefit developing countries in taxing automated digital services. So this is a positive development. There has also been an important activity in capacity building in the African continent in relation to tax authorities, for instance, in relation to transfer pricing. So these are positive developments, but a lot is still to be done. So with this introduction, let me then start with our discussion. Our first panelist, I hope he is already available, is Jose Antonio Ocampo. He is the chair of ICRIC. He is the former finance minister of Colombia. He is panelist at the UN FACTI panel. He was a distinguished member of the board of the South Center. So I'm very pleased to introduce him. I hope he's available. Jose Antonio?
Yes, I'm available, Carlos.
Okay, great. Nice to see you. Please, go ahead.
Very much for the invitation to be in this event today. Let me say that in a sense, I have been, as you mentioned, a member of the, first of all, the South Center board, which I am very proud of, and I continue to be one of your I don't know what is distinguished members. Anyway, but aside from that, as you mentioned, I was a member of the FACTI panel. In fact, in charge of the analysis of tax issues. And I also chair the ICRIC commission, the Independent Commission on Reform of International Corporate Taxation. We have been making a lot of analysis. We, of course, count with the support of many people, including some who are present here. And of course, also, by the way, with the, of course, with the membership of Irene Obonju Odidak, who is also going to speak in this event, and who also participated in the FACTI panel. Let me start by, I guess, underscoring some of your remarks on the issue of the consensus or agreement, rather than consensus reached in the OECD inclusive framework on taxation, and of course parallel proposals that we have been making. The first one is that I mean the major comment on the results of the inclusive framework that we have made from ICRIC is that it's of course a step forward, as you mentioned, but at the same time, it is frustrating for developing countries in general. I mean, the benefits that developing countries will get are minimal. In the case of the so-called Pillar 1, which will only cover a small number of large multinationals, they say because it's only covered multinationals with high profit margins on the one hand, but also it shares only 1/4 of their profits worldwide for taxation purposes. So according to all the analysis that have been made, the benefits will be very small worldwide, but they will basically be appropriated by the headquarters of those multinationals, which means that developing countries, of course, some large developing countries have multinationals, but you know the benefit is very small. Pillar 2, the one that established the minimum corporate income tax of effective 15%, is a more important reform in terms of the benefits that it will bring in terms of additional corporate taxation. But again, the benefits are going to be relatively minimal for developing countries. And again, the headquarters of the multinationals are going to be the best important beneficiaries of this. Again, it only affects large multinationals with more than 750 million euros in terms of revenues, and it does generate some exceptions which are troublesome. But anyway, for developing countries, the benefits is minimal, and the developing countries put on the table what they call a subject to tax rule that will have benefited them by having a minimum tax paid on certain revenues of multinationals that are not today subject to high levels of taxation. Services and capital gains in particular. That was the proposal. It was not adopted in the agreement. Let me say also, of course, that that in the case of Pillar 1, there is the rule that digital firms cannot be taxed nationally. or regionally, as it was the proposal in the case of the European Union, so that that constrains the capacity of developing countries also to tax these firms. In any case, if you don't discriminate in your taxation between domestic and foreign companies, you can establish certain taxes. For example, on the VAT on certain services. I mean, you could, of course, do that. But the restrictions, in a sense, the response of the U.S. and in particular to the Pillar 1 was that they will join the agreement, but on the conditions that the worldwide, particularly European, trend to tax digital companies will be stopped. Anyway, so that is a constraint in the face. For all these reasons, we have made a point that in the next round of negotiations, the issues of developing countries should be at the center. So they should not be considered the last round of negotiations, but there should be a new round of negotiations that should be actually encouraged in the case of the G20 by Indonesia and India, who are going to be the next chairs of the group of 20. So that's the a proposal that we have been making, and I hope it translates into actions in that area. Let me say also that both the ICRIC and the FACTI panel have been not only making probably more ambitious reforms of international corporate taxation. For example, in ICRIC, we originally proposed a minimum corporate income tax, global income tax of 25%, which is the average of the corporate taxes in developed countries, in OECD countries. But in the case of the FACTI panel, the proposal was a range between 20 and 30%. Anyway, those proposals were more ambitious than the 15%. And actually, it's quite important that, let's say, every percentage point above the 15% benefits more proportionally the developing countries. So the higher tax rate will have benefited the developing countries. But finally, both the FACTI panel and ICRIC have been proposing that we have to change the forum for international tax negotiations. And in this regard, we have followed the recommendations of developing countries in general. We have to remember that in the Addis Ababa Financing for Development Conference, the group of 77 and China proposed that the negotiations take place in an intergovernmental body in the United Nations, basically by upgrading the expert committee of the UN into an intergovernmental body. And that has been, again, the proposal of several developing countries after this round of negotiations in the inclusive framework. Let me perhaps proudly point out that when I was Under Secretary General of the UN, I made that proposal in 2004, under, of course, Kofi Annan's support. And I mean, when we actually, it was a bit peculiar that the tax committee of the UN was still an ad hoc body when I became the head of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs of the UN. And the first thing that we did, and that was approved, was to make it a permanent committee, but also to broaden its mandate. And it has played a fantastic role as a committee of experts. But I said I propose something similar to what the group of 77 proposed in 2015, which was to turn it into intergovernmental body for international tax cooperation. I think that proposal will be much better for developing countries because their voice in the UN is much stronger. I mean, one of the basic complaints that we have heard in the case of the inclusive framework, particularly from African countries, is that their voice is too weak in those negotiations. And I must say that that's probably true of all developing countries in general. I mean, of course, some of which are very important have a voice that is heard, but generally speaking, the imbalances in voice, or using the terminology, the Monterrey Consensus on Voice and Participation of developing countries in economic decision making, is something that is reflected actually in the current framework of negotiations. So we propose that the international tax negotiations should move to the UN, to an intergovernmental process in the United Nations, by upgrading the expert committee into an intergovernmental body. Thank you very much, Carlos, and thanks to all of you for listening to my remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Jose Antonio, for these very valuable comments and these insights. Also for reminding us that you proposed this intergovernmental body in 2004, but still, as we know, this is a long-standing request by developing countries, but is not being heard by developed countries. So it will be very important, as you mentioned, that developing countries can have a different forum in which their voice is actually heard, and they can influence the policy decision, which has not been the case in the process that led to the adoption of this so-called two-pillar solution. Let me make a couple of questions, Jose Antonio. The first one is, so this, of course, the creation of this intergovernmental body is crucial, as you have suggested. But now we have an urgent issue, and this is whether to endorse or not the so-called two-pillar solution. So what your recommendation will be in that respect? And the second question relates to the recommendation. The FACTI panel has made a number of very important recommendations. Could you highlight which of those recommendations will be priority for the African continent?
Well, in relation to your first question, I think most developing countries will endorse the agreement. I probably should, because but I guess they should make it clear that there has to be a new round of negotiations, which is, I think, the main point, that the interests of developing countries were poor in this round of negotiations, and therefore that they should be there should be a new round of negotiations, hopefully in the UN, but so far as the process continues to be under the inclusive framework, we use the inclusive framework. And probably to improve the voice of developing countries in the inclusive framework. Actually, one little detail that I always point out is that the composition of the technical team in OECD is too biased toward developed countries. That's why, interestingly, for example, the analysis that is done by the IMF on international tax issues is much more balanced, I think, among other reasons because the staff of the IMF actually has more developing country staff members. So it's interesting. I think I guess being from a developing country, I always have found that your perspective from where you were born is actually quite important, because you have been raised with certain issues that a person who has been raised in the developed country sometimes doesn't even understand. Anyway, so that's just a marginal point, but it's not an irrelevant one. But I think moving this into the UN is actually the best recommendation. But so far, I think the countries probably endorse this agreement, but request that there should be a new round of negotiations. Now, on your second, of course, the FACTI panel had many other issues in its agenda, in particular on illicit capital flows, which is a major issue in Africa. So I think those recommendations should be at the center of the agenda. In the area of taxation, I think I mostly mentioned the issue that we put in the agenda, because in a sense they are very similar to those that ICRIC has been raising, both in terms of the, for example, having a much broader base of taxation of multinationals, in which developing countries can share actually in the global profits of multinationals in terms of taxation, and also again that the minimum corporate tax rate at the global level should be, according to the FACTI panel, between 20 and 30%. Let me say that I think those are, I think, the basic, also institutional terms, of course, the recommendation to move the negotiations to the UN. I think all of those continue to be very relevant for the African countries, and I think unfortunately in the UN the vote on the FACTI panel was to north-south, so it's basically it was basically supported by the south and not by the north. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jose Antonio, for this clarification. Certainly, the views you have expressed about the minimal benefits that both Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 will bring to developing countries is also what has been the assessment made by the South Center. It is reflected in the statement I referred to and other papers we have produced in the last few months. And so the role of the South Center is to make these issues known and to ensure that developing countries' participation in these negotiations is effective. So thank you very much again for all these comments. So let me now move to our next speaker, is Irene Obonji Odida. She is a great personality in the area of taxation and the fight against illicit financial flows from Africa. She is a member of the high-level Mbekis panel. So we are very glad to have Irene in events. Irene, are you available?
Yes, thank you. Good morning.
Okay.
Can you hear?
Go ahead.
Hello. Yes. Good morning, Dr. Correa. Nice. Yes. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you very much to CODA and the South Center for inviting me to join this panel. I'm very happy to be here, both because of my participation on the Mbeki panel, but also on the FACTI panel, as my colleague Jose Ocampo mentioned, and my association with ICRIT and a number of other organizations, including the South Center and the Pan-African Lawyers Union and Tax Justice Network. I think that's just a reflection of the role that has been played by a variety of organizations who are part of the tax justice community, as well as intergovernmental processes looking at the issue of illicit financial flows. That issue, as the Honorable Minister from Pakistan mentioned in his address, has come higher up on the radar of the international community in the past. The Mbeki panel was one of those initiatives, in that case from the African Union, supported by UNECA, to highlight the issue, to put a spotlight on it, and bring it to the attention of African Union members in particular, but also through our report to highlight why the international community needs to deal with the issue. And fortunately, this was then picked up in the SDGs. We have SDG 16.4. The Addis Ababa Action Agenda also made a reference to illicit financial flows and its importance. And in 2020, the UN FACTI panel was set up to look at financial secrecy. And in our work, we connected this issue to illicit financial flows and the need to deal with financial transparency and the lack of it at a global level as a systemic problem, very much connected to the political economy, or the global economic system and the global financial system. For the Mbeki panel, the importance of that panel was that I think 2 or 3 issues. One, showing the commitment of the African region and members of the African Union to deal with an issue that has a direct impact in undermining domestic resources and mobilization of domestic resources and public revenues for African governments, as well, I would say, for other countries, particularly developing countries. So that commitment to the issue was underscored by the Mbeki panel and by the adoption of a special declaration by the AU Summit in 2015 on the issue, and the establishment of a consortium to follow up on the recommendations that we made. The same importance was attached to this issue by the UN Factor Panel, and similarly to the Mbeki panel, we recognized that illicit financial flows undermine the ability of countries to achieve sustainable development. We also underscored that commercial drivers of illicit financial flows are the primary issue. The Mbeki panel found that these commercial drivers account for two-thirds, almost two-thirds, 65% of illicit financial flows from Africa, while criminal drivers and corruption as a driver accounted for 30% and 5% respectively. And yet at a global level, the global architecture on commercial aspects of IFFs were underdeveloped. There was much more attention at a global level on the criminal issues such as terrorist financing and money laundering and corruption than on commercial drivers. My apologies, there seems to be some instability with my connection, and I think I dropped off for a few seconds. But I was saying, and I'll try to speed up because of time, that both the Mbeki panel and the FACTI panel recognize the importance of addressing the commercial drivers of illicit financial flows. Issues such as tax avoidance and tax evasion, transfer pricing and abuse of that, abusive trade practices and tax practices, as well as gaps in the global financial architecture, dealing with, say, tax havens, with the beneficial ownership, with the exchange of information, and with the country-by-country reporting by corporations. So these are some of the issues that we and gaps, in the double taxation agreements. So these are some of the kind of issues that we focused on. Now, connecting this to this really important agenda today, looking at taxing inequality and the rights of countries, particularly developing countries, and their taxing rights. It's important for us to recognize that the current architecture at a global level is insufficient, and this is really clear from the increase in illicit financial flows from 2015 for Africa, from 2015 when we did our report, which was about 50 billion, to 88.6 billion in 2020, as studied by UNCTAD last year. So this really shows clearly that current measures, current architecture is insufficient. And there were very clear proposals that were made both by the Mbeki panel and recently by the FACTI panel on what sort of measures need to be adopted at the global level, at a regional level, and at a country level. So given this, and given that not significant follow-up yet has been done to those two reports, it is important for policymakers from Africa to look at those recommendations and to take steps at a country level, at a regional level under the coordination of the African Union, and to push at a global level in conjunction with other developing countries in the G77, in a forum such as the UN, to ensure that the global architecture and the gaps within it related to financial transparency are dealt with by the global community. So the issue of inequalities in taxing rights is quite important, and that is a fundamental concern within the global architecture. My colleague, Mr. Ocampo, has already gone through a lot of the details on that, and so I will try not to repeat what he has said, but just to mention that these inequalities in taxing rights have long existed in international standards, particularly standards of the OECD, many of which were actually set close to 100 years ago, when all African countries actually were not yet independent, and majority of developing countries were not independent and were not able to participate in that meeting held by the then colonial countries to set these rules. In our recent times, the digitalization of the economy has added a new dimension to this problem and has made it difficult, as corporations, as transnational corporations have increasingly digitalized their business models. It has made it difficult for developing countries to tax these highly digitalized companies. Now, the OECD two-pillar solution was meant to deal with this issue, the challenges of taxation of the digital economy within the context of the OECD G20 inclusive framework. But as has been mentioned by a number of speakers today, it has been unhelpful for developing countries because majority of their demands, the substantive demands, were not taken on board in the negotiations, despite the specific proposals raised, for example, through the G24 group or specific countries coming from the global south. So as it is, the analysis that has been done by a number of organizations, including ICRIT and others, really illustrates that there is very little benefit in terms of increased revenue for developing countries and for African countries within that context. And largely, one can say that this two-pillar solution, based on the deal that was agreed on by G7 and later on taken up in G20, that this two-pillar solution was really mainly devised by the global north to shield tech giants headquartered within their jurisdictions from taxation by the global south. As has been elaborated already, the revenue benefits from both pillars, both pillar 1 and 2, are expected to be minimal, and in some cases are even estimated to lead to a loss of revenues. For example, the fact that countries that sign up to it will be required to give up unilateral measures, some of which they already have taken, Nigeria and Kenya, for example, and other countries out of Africa have taken. European countries as well have done this, but because of the design of the deal, which will give them additional taxing rights, they will stand to benefit from the new rules that would come into play. But because of the way the rules have been designed, countries from the global south, where majority of multinational corporations are not headquartered, will not gain much or will even lose. So the taking off of their ability, through fiscal sovereignty, to create unilateral measures will lead to losses in revenue and also giving up of future potential benefits. Other challenges within the deal include the commitments that they'll be required to take up around mandatory and binding arbitration. So going forward, developing countries need to think carefully, and African countries in particular, to think carefully whether to accede to any legally binding agreement on the two-pillar solution. As it is currently, what we have from our countries are political commitment, political agreement, but we have not yet reached the stage of signing a legally binding agreement. That is likely to come in 2022. And so the question out there for countries from the global south and Africa in particular to think about very carefully is whether they should actually sign a legally binding agreement under the OECD BEPS two-pillar solution, given the risks under it, the giving up of future fiscal space, and the real lack of benefits in terms of increased revenue to them because of the nature of our economies and because of the nature of the relationship between multinational corporations and jurisdictions in the global south. So there are a range of alternative options to tax a digitalized economy, in particular Article 12B that has been devised by the UN Tax Committee, as well as to continue to apply unilateral taxation measures. But it is also important for African countries and other countries in the global south to come together as regions, given their collective similar interests in this issue to do with taxing rights, and devise regional solutions around taxation that can apply within to the members of a particular region, or to look at these issues collectively as global south regions and push collectively for discussions and negotiations around taxing rights to happen at the UN as proposed by the FACTI panel. Two last things that I would like to raise, and these were really insights both from the panels, the two panels that I was a part of, but also in discussions and so on that have happened in the global tax community, particularly in the civil society. First of all, from the FACTI panel, we found very clearly the role of enablers in facilitating the offshore system as a major contributor to the continuance of illicit financial flows and the undermining of efforts taken by specific governments or by the global community to deal with fiscal transparency. That is an area that requires regulation and that requires action by individual governments, by regions, and by the global community. And secondly, that the second issue that I just want to stress is the political nature of dealing with financial transparency and with ending illicit financial flows, because of those who benefit, including enablers, but of the multinational corporations, the countries where they are headquartered. They are very deep vested interests in protecting the current system. Jose Ocampo has alluded to the lack of support for the FACTI panel by some countries, particularly countries from the global north. That has continued, and the lack of and has reflected the history around this issue, even within the UN, right from the 60s and 70s. So the political nature of this problem means it's important for policymakers, for political leaders to engage with the issue and not to leave it for countries from the global south, from Africa in particular, not to leave it to a technical discussion that is purely where negotiations externally in the BEPS process, for example, are purely led by technical institutions, by revenue bodies and so on. There's a need for engagement of policymakers on this issue at the highest level, and for an all-of-government approach to deal with illicit financial flows and the fight for increased taxing rights based on fairness for African countries and for developing countries at large. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irene, for these very, very clear comments and having your opinion on the advantages and disadvantages of the so-called two-pillar solution. Thank you for recalling the concept of taxing rights of countries, in particular taxing rights of developing countries. Is very important to have this concept as the basis for any negotiation or discussion on the subject. Also, what you mentioned about the current structure, the inequalities in the current structure, the lack of transparency. I think the point you made about the need to have a collective action at the regional level, at the African level, is very key. In particular now, with the new free trade agreement for the continent, it is crucial for African countries to work together in order to assert these taxing rights you are referring to. And also your comment about the nature of these illicit financial flows. This is not an African problem. This is a problem of the global community. This is taking place because measures are not taken in the global north. And this is not just a problem that can be solved on the basis of the action by African countries. As you said, it's not a technical issue, it's a political issue. So it's very important. And we are very thankful for the ministers that are participating in this event, and also former ministers and policymakers. It's very important, as you said, for them to be engaged. So I have a question for you, Irene. So as you know, has already been mentioned, Nigeria, Kenya, Pakistan, and also Sri Lanka, they have not endorsed the so-called two-pillar solution. So what do you think African countries should do? Jose Antonio has already given his opinion, what should be done. So what is your opinion? What African countries should do? Should they have the similar stance as Nigeria and Kenya? Should they go for endorsing and then reopening for negotiation? So what's your opinion on this, Irene? Irene, did you get my question? Okay, well, apparently she's frozen. Okay, did we get her back? I hope so. So let me just make an announcement, and this is that as it has been suggested, it will be very important to have an assessment of what benefits could actually be drawn from the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, and also in comparison with the solutions being proposed by the Young Tax Committee, which is called the Article 12B. And in this regard, I'm glad to announce that the South Center and CODA, we are jointly making a call for papers in order to make an assessment, country assessment of what these benefits will be for members of the South Center and also members of the Group of 77 plus China. So this announcement will be made public. We are making a call for experts, for those working in this area, for people working in tax administration, to provide us this analysis in order to know better what is actually the expected outcome in terms of benefits for developing countries. What we need is to quantify, to put numbers to this. So we know, it has been already mentioned, that all estimates indicate that benefits will be very small, but we want to put some numbers on this, and then this is the very purpose of this call. So Irene, are you there? So if not, let me then go on. Let's continue with the panel. So thank you very much, Irene. I hope you can reconnect. So the next speaker is Professor Jomo Kwame Sundaran. He is a member of the CODA Technical Committee on Domestic Resource Mobilization. Professor Sundaran, are you available? Professor Sundaran?
Thank you very much,
okay, all right, great.
I'm
Great.
sorry,
Please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to join you today to discuss a very important subject. My task has been made very much easier by the last two speakers who have addressed some of the most pressing issues which we need to face. I think, however, it is useful for us to reflect a little bit on the background to the situation in which developing countries find themselves today. Most importantly, I think it is useful for us to recognize that major sources of revenue have been lost over the decades. And it is for this reason, it is very important for us to enhance our taxing rights. But instead, what has happened in the name of cooperation in recent decades has been an erosion of the ability of developing countries to collect taxes. There's a long history to that, and we also know that because of the very nature of colonial finances, particularly in Africa and Asia, the post-colonial tax regimes have been not only continue to be regressive, as was the case during the colonial period, but also continue to be fragile. We have also seen how in recent decades, the push towards trade liberalization has resulted in a significant fall of trade-related revenues. And we have seen how the last 3 decades or so of globalization has seen greater international financial liberalization, going well beyond what is provided for by the Articles of Agreement of the International Monetary Fund. For example, Article 4 of the Articles of Agreement reserve the right to control the capital account to two countries. But what we have seen over the last 3 decades, beginning from the time when Michel Camdessou was the managing director, has been a significant giving up of these rights by many developing countries because of the advice they were getting from the international financial institutions. So as a result of all this, we have a range of issues which we are all familiar with, but it's useful to remind ourselves of the increasing phenomenon of offshoring of headquarters of our country, of firms which are operating in our countries, the inability to discriminate in favor of national firms, and therefore the difficulties of collecting taxes from those firms, the increasing problems of financial secrecy, a variety of problems of financial secrecy, not simply related to the banking system, and of course the whole problem of tax havens, which we have found hugely problematic, and which the OECD, until the earlier part of the last decade, was singularly preoccupied with. In fact, it wasn't even preoccupied only with tax havens. They were very focused on what were called offshore tax havens in places such as the Caribbean and so on and so forth. However, the world has changed fairly rapidly as far as many of these issues are concerned. And I think it is very important to remind ourselves, as Jose Antonio Ocampo reminded us, about the importance of having an inclusive forum where we all participate as equals. And that has been proposed from at least almost 2 decades ago in the form of a UN tax committee and the creation of a UN tax convention. So if there are going to be any concessions as far as the OECD inclusive framework is concerned, I think it is important for us to emphasize that this should be conditional upon whatever concessions are made by developing countries should be conditional on the creation and the full participation of all member states in a process to develop a UN tax convention. I think this was emphasized in the FACTI panel report and has been emphasized time and again by many countries and the G77, and very importantly as well as by the G24. I'll come back to this issue, well, maybe I should mention it now. I think in this framework, as Ocampo reminded us, it is important to recognize that the IMF, for a variety of reasons, has been much more sensitive to the needs and the challenges faced by developing countries. So it is often alleged that the UN does not have the technical capacity to provide the kind of technical support for a UN process, but we should not forget that the Bretton Woods institutions continue to remain UN institutions, and that they should be willing to serve, and the IMF in particular can provide the kind of support for the technical work which the UN currently may not have. A second issue, I think, which is extremely important to emphasize, as both our previous speakers have emphasized, is the whole question of the limitations of the current proposal on a minimum global corporate income tax proposal. The ICRIT commission led by Jose Antonio Ocampo had proposed a rate of, I think, 25%. When Janet Yellen endorsed the idea of a global corporate minimum income tax rate, she had mentioned a number of 21%. It was left to the host of the G7 meeting, which really has no real status beyond being a club of the biggest and rich countries, who to push it down further to 15%. And unfortunately, the G20 endorsed that 15% level. other details, some of which have been mentioned by our speakers, but I think it is important to recognize that what it will yield is actually quite modest. And as we are seeing, although we are developing countries have welcomed the issuance of special drawing rights by the fund, we also see that the rights have not been allocated back to the fund or to the 15 other institutions which have rights in order that for developing countries to be able to make use of the SDGs much more. There are, of course, a range of issues involving digital taxation, which are very important for us to get into and to consider. But I think it is, without getting into the details there, because many of the details are quite technical, I think it is important for us to recognize that the current proposals, including the proposals of the inclusive framework, propose distribution of taxation on the basis of consumption. Now, we know that the consumers, the richest consumers, are primarily in the rich countries. And it's important for us to recognize the principle that production also matters, because it is in production that developing countries participate much more. We all also are quite aware, for example, of how the third largest gold producer in Africa, Tanzania, basically has been effectively subsidizing foreign gold mining companies operating in Tanzania, because they do not collect much revenue from these companies, but instead provide a great deal in terms of infrastructure as well as other facilities and services. So if I can quickly try to summarize, I think what we have seen in the recent period has been, since the end of the first Cold War, a significant decline in overseas development assistance. And we have seen new trends, especially in the last decade, of so-called blended finance and facilitating public-private partnerships and so on, where EA is no longer actually going to many of the countries, but instead being used to enable companies from the so-called donors to advance their interests. We have also seen in the recent period how the rich countries have resisted the proposal, strongly supported by most developing countries, for a waiver on TRIPS. I've already mentioned the problem of the distribution of the SDGs, which has a lot to do with the distribution of voting rights and other related matters, which are too detailed to get into right now. But I think right now we also see how during the pandemic, logistical supply chains have been greatly disrupted. As a consequence, we have seen food supply chains disrupted, and we have seen food security and nutrition being adversely affected. We need to recognize that the tariffs, for example, to support food security and nutrition were not simply for revenue purposes, but were very, very important. And now we find that many countries, especially in Africa, have become very, very vulnerable precisely because of this disruption. And we have also seen last month how in Glasgow, there were no concessions on climate finance. Whatever climate finance exists is largely for mitigation, very little for adaptation, and even less for compensating developing countries for the losses and damage which they have already experienced. So we have to work together. And this is why I particularly appreciate the collaboration between CODA, which was involved in supporting the Mbeki Commission in fighting against, in identifying illicit financial flows. I would here emphasize that illicit financial flows are not peculiar to African countries. They plague many other developing countries, but they are especially severe for African countries, undoubtedly. And also, I think it is important to recognize that this collaboration between CODA, which provides the support for the Mbeki Commission, and the South Center is most welcome, because in a sense, what we have realized is that this participation in international negotiations without the solidarity of the entire global South is going to be hugely problematic. And African countries have recently perhaps provided the greatest demonstration of collective action, the African Continental Free Trade Area, and also the Mbeki Commission, which I referred to earlier. So we have a number of instances, and this kind of collaboration should be taken further and should involve, we should involve the entire Global South in supporting these struggles. Let me stop here. Thank you very much, Dr. Correa.
Thank you, Professor Sundaran, for these comments and the views. In particular, the fact that you have connected the issue of taxation and the problems that developing countries are facing with other areas such as climate change, the TRIPS waiver, which is under negotiation in WTO. So all these issues are really connected. Also for emphasizing the need to continue working together and for making a comment on the role of the South Center. The South Center is very much engaged in this area, is trying to provide support to the negotiators of developing countries, to interact with the UN Tax Committee, to provide advice in order to improve the capacity of tax administrations to work and get the needed revenues. You also mentioned the UN Tax Convention. I think that's an important concept, and the need, as it was already mentioned by Professor Ocampo as well, to move this to a discussion at the UN level and to have a permanent body established there in which the voice of the developing countries can actually be heard. I would like to make a couple of questions, Professor Sundaran, if you allow me. So the first one, if you...
Professor Correa, if I may, this is Swag.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you, sir. So, yes, before we move to the presentation of Dr. Hakim Ben Hamouda, I wanted to announce that Dr. Orama, the Chief Economist of African Development Bank, is represented by Dr. Hanan Morsi. And also, if we could take now quickly, just we heard back from the Minister, the Honorable Minister of Nigeria. Maybe we can give the floor to Dr. Dipiolo Adeyemi Dipuolu so that he can tell us. He just got her. We heard back from her. Dr. Dipiolo, if I may.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Swadan. Thank you. Just to say that the Honorable Minister has had to go from the State House to the National Assembly. We're in the process of finalizing the budget for next year, and the National Assembly summoned her because they are about to go on recess. And so she just asked me to express her sincere apologies. In the system we run, Parliament is supreme. And so she has to go there if she wants her budget for next year passed. So she's asked me to extend her sincere apologies. We will circulate her statement very shortly and hope that that will help throw some more light on the issues. Once again, apologies, sincere apologies on her behalf. Thank you. Over to you, Swat.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dipuolu. Dr. Correa, it's over to you. The other speakers are also aligned. Dr. Ben Hamouda, the former Minister of Finance of Tunisia, and Dr. Hanan Morsi of the African Development Bank, replacing the Chief Economist of the African Development Bank. Thank you very much.
Is Sol Picciotto also available?
I'm sorry.
Okay, great. So, good to know. So let me just conclude the session with Professor Sundaran. I had a couple of questions, if you're still available, Professor. So, yeah, so, well, thank you very much again for your very insightful comments, presentations, and very concrete proposals about the need to act collectively You also mentioned the situation in which national firms are discriminated against, and this is one of the outcomes that we are now having with this the outcomes of this inclusive framework. But one question is, as it was mentioned, and the estimates of UNCTAD are quite clear in this respect. You also mentioned that the illicit financial flows are not peculiar to Africa. Other regions, other continents are also suffering from this, but these flows are not quantified. But the question is, why are they still increasing? Because it was noted in the last report, there has been a significant increase, more than 70% in 5 years. So why is it that despite the efforts which are made by tax administrations in Africa and some other measures which are taken in relation to the so-called tax havens, why is it still going on? Or what's your interpretation for this? How can this be stopped?
My own suspicion is that part of it is because we have seen although people talk about the deglobalization in the recent period, my own belief is that in fact there has not been a significant reversal of trade liberalization. So it is increasingly possible with greater trade to actually use trade flows to conceal some of the outward capital flows. In addition, we have seen many developing countries basically giving up capital controls. Capital controls became a dirty word in the 1980s and 1990s. And so when my former Prime Minister introduced capital controls, very limited and qualified they were, that was considered to be very blasphemous almost. So it has been extremely difficult. So countries have actually almost voluntarily given up their right to control capital flows. I think what we need to think about is what kinds of smart capital account management measures should be reintroduced in this situation. And this is something which we proposed some years ago when, in some papers which we did for I used to work with Professor Ocampo before, and some of this work continued after he left the UN. And I think so there is some work going on, but not enough, because as you know very well, Dr. Correa, the circumstances of developing countries are so varied that it's very difficult to provide one-size-fits-all solutions. So it becomes very important to identify some general desirable practices and standards, but beyond that, it is often that kind of support which is needed. And this is why it is precisely important for the IMF to go back to its original mandate, particularly under Article 4 of its Articles of Agreement, to help developing countries to develop much more smart capital account management techniques. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for these comments. I think they are very interesting. I think more attention should be given to this issue of capital control. The South Center has followed this in the past and has also promoted the solution, as you mentioned, custom-made solutions, taking into account the needs and conditions of particular countries. But in addition to tax issues, I think it would be very important to look at this issue again more carefully, because as you are suggesting, this may be one of the reasons that explain this continuous increase in illicit financial flows. So I'm very happy that you made this comment. Also, thank you, as I did refer before, of this reference you made about the UN convention, UN tax convention. I think that's also an interesting concept. So maybe there will be other opportunities to elaborate on this and what the possible content and objectives of these conventions could be, which may give the opportunity for developing countries to assert the taxing right, which is not, as we are talking, the situation right now. So thank you very much again for your contribution, and please still remain available because we have a session for questions after the presentations are made. So then the next speaker is Sol Picciotto. He's the coordinator of BEPS Monitoring Group, BMG. So he has made great work in this area. He has made excellent contributions also to the South Center. So we are very, very pleased to have Dr. Picciotto with us. Dr. Picciotto, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to participate. I have a short presentation, which I hope you can see.
Yes, we can.
So I think it's worth reminding ourselves that this attempt to reform international corporate tax rules goes back nearly 10 years now. It was in 2012, following the financial crisis, that at first the OECD's Fiscal Committee launched this project on base erosion and profit shifting, known as BEPS. Then they got political support, first from the G7, then the G20 in 2013. And it was only once it was underway that wider participation was opened up. The first package of reports came out already in 2015, but although they were very extensive, they made the system more complex, and they really essentially patched up existing rules. And particularly Action 1, which was to look at the impact of digitalization, really no progress was made in that phase at all. Probably the main progress was to agree on country-by-country reports. This will be the first time that multinational enterprises are required to submit to tax authorities a report on their activities worldwide with a detailed, with information on their presence in each country. And this was a specific political requirement from the G20 to the OECD, which initially, in fact, the OECD technical experts found difficult to understand, but eventually they did. However, it has been limited to being supplied only to tax authorities, and the procedure is for the country-by-country reports to be delivered only to the home country of each multinational, which only shares them with other countries through a kind of bureaucratic process of exchange of information. And so far, unfortunately, rather few lower income countries are even receiving the reports. So although that was a major step forward for major countries, for the lower income countries, they haven't even had the benefit so far of receiving country by country reports. And more widely, they're not publicly available. In fact, there's nothing confidential in these reports. They should be published so that the public and other experts can scrutinize and would get great benefit from analyzing the data in these reports. But unfortunately, they've been kept confidential. So that was a rather modest gain, if you like. It was only following that that the process was opened up to other countries through the so-called inclusive framework. But those countries, if they wanted to join, had to accept the existing commitments, which obviously had been negotiated without their participation. And there's obviously also an expense involved. So although a number of lower income countries have joined, there's still quite a large number, particularly from Africa, which have not joined. And it was really only in 2018 that the issue of tackling the tax challenges, as they call them, of digitalization was really seriously addressed in this follow-up report in 2018. And then as more and more lower income countries got involved, finally we began to see some impact on the negotiations, particularly through the G24, which in December 2019 put forward some quite important proposals, which began to be taken a bit more seriously. And it's only then since the beginning of 2020, really relatively recently, there's been a more determined attempt to tackle those broader problems. In the meantime, we should remember there were other actions took place. A number of countries took national measures to fill the gap of the failure, really the essential failure of the phase one of of the BEPS project. Many countries introduced national measures. India was first to introduce what they called an equalization levy on digitalized advertising. And then France followed with a broader digital services tax, and a number of other countries, particularly in Europe. But then we had US countermeasures against those, treating them as trade barriers. The US then also unilaterally reformed its own tax rules. And quite importantly, the 2016 US reforms included measures against base erosion and profit shifting from the US perspective. So the so-called GILTI and BEAT taxes, which obviously I don't have time to go into in detail, really were aimed at protecting the US tax base. Also other countries, the United Kingdom enacted a diverted profits tax, Australia a similar one, and also India and Nigeria, and I think a few other countries, but particularly India and Nigeria, have introduced a proposal for a taxable nexus based on significant economic presence instead of the physical presence requirement traditionally required in tax treaties. And in the meantime, also, the developing country members of the United Nations Committee of Tax Experts, which has also been mentioned, became much more active and pressed, first of all, for the negotiation of a new model provision in the Model Tax Treaty, the UN model, for fees for technical services, which are already in many bilateral treaties, but now they created by 2017 a model provision for that. And then perhaps even more importantly, concluded just earlier this year, Article 12B for withholding tax, but also with an option for taxation on a net taxable profits basis of income from automated digital services. So this extends the possibilities under, if you do adopt the UN model, for taxation at source of services, which is very important, as I'll explain. So that's the background really to the latest phase, which has gone on really only for about 18 months or 2 years, which we've heard about, resulting in the so-called two-pillar solution. We've heard an outline of it, so this slide just recapitulates what Jose Antonio and Irene Vongiagida has already mentioned. Pillar 1 would apply only to the largest and most profitable multinationals. It excludes finance and extractives, although how you define those might be difficult. And it would therefore apply only to about the 100 largest multinationals in the world, those with over 20 billion euros in turnover and a 10% global profit rate, and as an in-country sales threshold of €1 million, although it's reduced for countries with smaller GDPs. And it would allocate only a small proportion of the profits even of those companies. It would do so on the basis of treating those companies in accordance with the economic reality that they are unitary companies, single enterprises. So it would look at their global profits, but it would allocate only 25% of their profits over 10%. And it would allocate it to countries according to where they have sales revenues. Now, the existing rules, the so-called transfer pricing rules, which apply, again, according to what's described as the arm's length principle, will continue to apply for the rest of the profits of those 100, but also for all other multinationals. So effectively, this so-called Pillar 1 really does not affect the vast majority of tax rules. They will remain exactly as they are, except for a small proportion of the profits of a very small number of companies. The procedure for applying this so-called Amount A would be through a self-assessment return by the multinational submitted to its home country tax authority, which could then be verified by a panel of representatives of countries affected if they wish to request a verification process. And then if there's any disagreement about either the assessment or the allocation, ultimately there will be a mandatory dispute resolution, both for the amount itself, but also for related issues, which would include whether the amount is correctly assessed. So it could extend beyond Amount A itself to related tax issues. The details we don't know yet. That will be the method for administering this so-called Amount A. So it's within a club of the countries concerned. And then it will be conditional for countries participating in this system that they should withdraw existing digital services taxes, but also other similar measures. Now, there isn't yet a definition. We don't yet know until they publish the agreement in detail what are other similar measures. It's not clear whether it would apply to any online sales tax. I think probably it's unlikely. And many countries are now adopting specific taxes, for example, on mobile money or on social media. It's not clear whether they would be included in this agreement if you join. Then there's the so-called Pillar 2, which the main element of Pillar 2 is this so-called global minimum tax, sometimes described as a GLOBE, which apply to multinationals with over 750 million euro of revenue. So it would be around, I think, about 3,800 multinationals. So that would still exclude many that are quite important in smaller countries. There may be a multinational that on the global level is below that threshold, but nevertheless quite important in specific lower income countries, but they would not be included. This would apply a top-up tax on profits in countries where the effective tax rate applied to those profits is below 15%. Now, that obviously the level, 15%, as has already been mentioned, is pretty low compared to the average corporate tax rate globally of around 25%. So it wouldn't discourage shifting of profits very much out of countries which are applying 25% if you could still get 15% rate elsewhere without penalty. But more importantly, I think, is to consider how the effective tax rate will be calculated. It will be calculated on a definition of taxable profits based on financial accounting rules. And these might still allow a deduction of quite a lot of costs of investment. Particularly, we're concerned about amortization of acquisition costs, for example, of research and development. So it might be possible, and many companies are already doing that, to transfer intellectual property rights to low-income jurisdictions and then amortize the costs of acquisition over a number of years. There would also be a carve-out, which is quite high during a phase-out period of 10 years. And most importantly, I think the GLOBE applies priority to the home country tax rights. So there's a clear imbalance of the allocation of the right to apply this top-up tax. It gives priority to the home country. And this rejected a proposal which a number of experts, including myself, put forward for a formulaic allocation of these taxing rights, which was forwarded by some of the lower income country members of the inclusive framework to the OECD, but it was not taken forward. So instead we have this imbalanced allocation in the GLOBE. Nevertheless, because of that pressure from lower income countries, it has been agreed that an integral part of this package should be this so-called subject to tax rule, which in effect would be a kind of new withholding tax on any payments which in the receiving country are taxed at below a 9% effective tax rate. So that's obviously lower than the 15% for the GLOBE. But now bear in mind that 9% is not only the measure of the effective tax rate, but also the maximum of the withholding tax that can be applied. So if payments are taxed below 9%, then the top-up tax can be applied to bring the taxation up to 9%. And that would apply to payments for interest, royalties, and so far we only know that it might apply to a defined set of other payments. Until the full package is published, we hope in the next few days or a week, we don't know what those other payments are. The key issue is services. Many services payments for services are used to shift profits out of source jurisdictions. And we don't know the extent of the services payments that might be within the scope of the subject to tax rule, but I think it's very unlikely that it would extend to digital services, because that's supposedly covered by Pillar 1. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that this is like, as I said, a new withholding tax, but existing tax treaties for the vast majority allow withholding taxes on interests and royalties at a higher rate. Usually the standard withholding tax rates for interest and royalties are 10, 15, sometimes in fact as high as 20 or 25% for some types of royalties. So the STTR is a rather limited proposal for a withholding tax. Now, how will this be implemented? I think it's worth bearing in mind, and I think Irina von Giardina has already pointed out, this will be a package deal, which is effectively, it's called an agreement, but the agreement is really a political commitment. It will not be a single binding international agreement. There will be one multilateral convention for Pillar 1, backed up with, we understand, model rules for countries to implement in domestic law. And for that multilateral convention on Pillar 1 to come into effect, it would need to be ratified by a critical mass of countries. The aim is by 2023. Now, the key point here, which has been very little discussed, I think, is ratification of a tax treaty in all countries, I think. Obviously, it requires a political decision, but in almost all countries, it requires approval of Parliament. We just heard the reason the Honourable Minister from Nigeria couldn't join us is that Nigeria's Parliament really calls the shots, and it's parliaments that have to consider ratification of treaties. Now, obviously, a key country for the critical mass would be the United States, and in the United States, ratification of tax treaties has generally been done by the Senate, requiring a 2/3 majority. So for the US to participate in a Pillar 1 convention would require approval, as far as we know, by 2/3 of the US Senate, which is a pretty demanding ask, I think, at the moment. Pillar 2 would be implemented. Firstly, the globe does not require a tax treaty. It's been designed according to the OECD technical experts so that it could be applied, could be implemented, because it's in parallel, it's similar to what the US already has in its domestic rules. So other countries could do it unilaterally. The attempt through the globe is to do a coordinated system by the OECD providing model rules and an implementation framework. Now, how that will take place would be interesting. It doesn't need a treaty, but if it doesn't have a treaty, it's quite hard to know how these detailed model rules, which are likely to amount to hundreds of pages, or certainly tens of pages. The blueprint we had last year was about 250 pages for the whole of Pillar 2, and the globe rules were a substantial part of that. How that would be done in a uniform way without a treaty is hard to know, but it could be done without a treaty. But nevertheless, the model rules would have considerable force. Now, the other measure, which is supposed to be an integral element, which is the only measure that would really benefit capital importing countries, which obviously most of the lower income countries are, the subject to tax rule, that could only be done by changing existing conflicting tax treaties. So there would be a model treaty provision and apparently a coordinated process for implementing it through some kind of multilateral instrument, but it would not be able to take effect until it's been ratified by all relevant countries. Now, there's a commitment by inclusive frameworks. There will be a commitment by inclusive framework members, if they have a corporate income tax rate below 9%, to implement this measure in their treaties with lower income countries. But until that's done, they would get no benefit. So as I say, this is a political commitment package. It's a misnomer to call it an agreement, if you like. Countries, obviously some countries have already said they're not going along with it. Even countries that have said, yeah, okay, fine, we accept the agreement, you have then to see whether they actually sign and then most importantly ratify the implementing conventions. So in that situation, what are the options, particularly for African countries? Obviously, they have to consider participation in the package. Countries that are not members of the inclusive framework would not even have a political commitment, but even those that are members could either say that they're not participating, as Nigeria and Kenya have done, or in any case, there would have to be a political decision, even which parts of the package to implement. Should they join Pillar 1? Even if they haven't disagreed with the package, they nevertheless have to decide whether to ratify the implementing convention of Pillar 1. And that entails some kind of cost-benefit analysis. What would be the benefits? How much revenue do you estimate you might gain? I'm not an economist, but the economists have said possibly $80 to $100 billion globally, worldwide. But as we've already seen, with only 100 companies, the amount that would actually come to lower income countries is likely to be very low, if anything. But that's for economists to calculate. And they have to set against that the obligation to withdraw digital services taxes and other similar measures, whatever they may be. But also, it's non-negligible cost of administering that system. Now, Pillar 2, countries would have to decide do they want to implement the globe. Now, the globe, as we already said, it's imbalanced in any case. The only benefit for a capital importing country would be this under-tax payment rule, but you'd have to consider, is it an improvement on alternative measures that you might be able to introduce? And in any case, it is only a backup. The home country gets the first bite of the cherry, if you like, and it's likely to be a large bite. The subject to tax rule, well, that would have to be implemented in your treaties, so you'd have to consider what is the scope. At the moment, it seems quite limited. If it's only a limited range of payments other than interest and royalties, and the rate at 9% seems very low compared to standard withholding tax rates. Now, other measures which countries can and should take, which they could take whether or not they participate, and I strongly suggest should take, is to strengthen their taxes on non-resident companies. The one big gain, particularly from Pillar 2, whether or not you participate, is that if home countries and multinationals are now going to apply a minimum effective tax rate of 15%, that would remove any remaining argument that taxation at source might discourage inward investment. If any profits diverted, shifted out of source countries, is anyway going to be taxed by the home country, even at the minimum rate of 15%, then that removes the incentive. So there's no reason at all why source countries should not increase source taxation. And in any case, I would argue that particularly for services, the restrictions on host country taxation of non-residents, restricting their rights to tax only if that non-resident actually has a physical presence, actually discourages non-residents from investing, from having genuine investments in the country. It actually encourages them to go on providing services without a physical presence. And they're obviously then competing with domestic providers of similar services which do have a physical presence and therefore employ people locally. Why would any country give a tax incentive to companies that actually do not employ people locally? So there's a very strong case, I think, for taxation of services delivered by non-residents. Now that could be either through withholding taxes or through net profit taxation. Withholding taxes have the advantage that they're easy to apply, but they apply to the gross payments. And so you have to consider what will be an appropriate level in relation to the net profit from delivering the service. There are net profit options. As I've already said, you could enact a significant economic presence test, so to move away from the physical presence requirement for services, and perhaps combine that with a formulaic allocation of for the attribution of profits. Now that has already been proposed by India. India's already enacted a significant economic presence tax, as has Nigeria. And India has consulted on combining that with a formulaic method for allocating the profits. And Nigeria also has domestic powers to apply a similar approach. So that those are the kinds of measures that I would urge all capital importing countries to consider, and they should apply to all services, irrelevant whether they're digitalized or not. All services can be delivered with minimal physical presence. Digitalization helps that, significantly facilitates that, but it shouldn't be limited to digitalized. And not limiting it to digitalized also means it's harder to treat these as trade barriers and trigger, therefore, retaliatory trade sanctions. The final measure I think all countries should consider would be an alternative minimum tax. A number of countries have those, usually as a backup, but I think those could be significantly strengthened. And finally, all capital importing countries should review their existing tax treaties. Now, in the light of BEPS in particular, but in any case, it's very important to review treaties to ensure that they comply with a minimum standard, which should be to give the country the power, the right to enforce, ensure it has the power to enforce its right to tax all income derived from activities performed in that country. Now, particularly in relation to services, that could be done by ensuring that all treaties include either a single broad article covering all types of services. There is a model for that in the commentary of the UN model to Article 12A, or an alternative is to combine, to have both Article 12A and 12B from the UN model. 12A, as I've already said, to fees for technical services, which doesn't include digital services, and then 12B, which specifically includes automated digital services, which also has a net income option. So all that's a little complicated, but I think all countries should review their treaties. Now, finally, I just want to bring up the broader point, which is we've talked about the imbalance in the allocation of tax rights, but I think is a reflection and results from the imbalance in the institutional architecture. The tax treaty rules have been developed historically primarily by the OECD, which is a group of countries which are capital exporting as well as capital importing. But the lower income countries are only capital importing. So the OECD model really encouraged foreign direct investment by minimizing taxes on foreign direct investment, really to the detriment of countries that are largely importers of capital. So the institutional framework needs to be addressed. The problem at the moment is we have no political accountability of the work of this inclusive framework for countries that are not members of either the G7, the OECD, or the G20. So the so-called agreement that's going to come out from the inclusive framework has no political accountability to any political body, including the large number of members of the inclusive framework. And the existing architecture really has very little coordination between the work of that inclusive framework, the UN Committee of Experts on Tax, the World Bank, the IMF. It's really a very incoherent and imbalanced system. So following on from the work of the FACTI panel, which proposed both a multilateral convention and proposed to develop proposals for a global tax body, Abdul Chowdhury and I have published for the South Centre a briefing which proposes a new approach, an alternative approach to rationalise the architecture by creating a framework convention on tax cooperation. So it will combine an actual convention with broad obligations on tax cooperation, which would cover mutual administrative assistance in tax assessment and collection. And these would be obligations for participating states to give each other that assistance, and perhaps broad aims for how to coordinate taxation, particularly of international activities. And then an institutional framework. Now we're suggesting it should be similar to the Framework Convention on Climate Change, that these kinds of framework conventions usually have a conference of the parties which meets at a high political level on a regular basis. It might be every few years, or if things get important, as they have with climate change, perhaps even every year. But that will give high political impetus to the work of a wider range of subsidiary bodies, each of which could be at the appropriate technical level. So it would give political accountability for that technical work, and the technical work could pursue at different levels, could be pursued at different levels. It would also create an umbrella for existing and perhaps even new conventions and standards. So this would be a rationalization by subsuming existing global bodies. That's our proposal. As I say, further details are in that South Centre policy brief. Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity.
Dr. Picciotto, thank you very much for this very clear presentation. You have addressed the background. You have made a very clear explanation of what the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 are, how they should be implemented, and differences in implementation of these two pillars. You have also suggested alternatives, in particular, taxing the services of non-resident companies. I think your argument is really very, very strong, that otherwise you are giving some preferential treatment to companies that do businesses in our countries, but do not pay taxes and do not create jobs or create value added. So thank you very much for your presentation. So I would like now to move to presentation by His Excellency Hakim Ben Hamouda. He was the former Minister of Finance, Republic of Tunisia, and member of the CODA Technical Committee on Domestic Resource Mobilization. So thank you very much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. In fact, my presentation, and since we went too much on the substantive issue, my presentation was just to give an idea to present the co-organizer of this webinar, the CODA and its technical committee. So I will be really very, very brief. We have a presentation. We are going to share it with you, but I'm really going to be very, very brief, because I think the conversation now is dealing with substantive issues, and I think we would like to continue this conversation on the issue raised by my colleagues, actually, Professor Jomo, who is member of the technical committee of the CODA on domestic resource mobilization. Just too few how to call it, issues. Just limit my presentation to really very few elements, just to brief the colleagues who are following this webinar on the activities done by the CODA and the technical committee, more particularly the technical committee of CODA. As a matter of introduction, we just this technical committee is a new unit and a new framework created by CODA and inaugurated on the 5th of May 2021 to boost the capacity for African government to adopt and implement efficient fiscal policies on the basis of for better resource mobilization. We assist CODA in providing a clear and convincing African voice to ensure, among others, that the international tax regime is more transparent and fairer to Africa. The objective of this technical committee is, of course, of overseeing the development and dissemination of technical and policy paper developed to support and advise government on fiscal policies and domestic resources, engaging, in fact, African government and the African Union and the international community through diplomatic advocacy and policy dialogue in pursuit of its objective. We also trying to provide some guidance to the Secretariat of the High-Level Panel on Illicit Financial Flows from Africa. And through commissioning some research and some papers to effectively influence, in fact, the policies and decision-making. And we are supporting also diplomatic and media campaigns for intergovernmental processes, including by the African Union. So this is who we are. I think this is the composition of the committee. I'm chairing with my colleague and friend, Dr. Diopolo, Special Advisor of the President of Nigeria, with my colleagues Maxwell Kwazalamba, Professor Jomo, Sundaran, Buna Silla, and with our colleague Suad, representing the CODA Secretariat, and Professor Sylvain Boku. As I said, Mr. Chair and colleagues, just going to give you an idea about the different technical papers we were able, in fact, to produce in the last couple of months to support African government and to support African voices. As for the content, I think that what my colleague Jomo, Professor Jomo, said is really representing, in fact, the ideas, and we are trying to develop, and we are trying really to push with the African constituency. We published, and we were able, in fact, to produce 3 publications in the last couple of months. The first one on financing post-COVID relief, recovery and reform in Africa. And more particularly, in fact, what we wanted to examine and to help African countries with is really the impact of SDRs, and more particularly, in fact, the debate of channeling the SDR from the high-income countries to African countries. And we were able to produce a paper on this and some recommendation for African countries. We also were able to produce a paper on global minimum tax. And we tried, in fact, to see the implication for African countries. And the last paper, or the third paper, was on fiscal policy and domestic resource mobilization in Africa in the face of the COVID pandemic. So this is basically the kind of paper we were able to produce. We organized, in fact, some webinars and policy dialogue on debt relief and revenue mobilization last June. And so basically, this is, I don't want to really repeat what my colleagues and my colleague Jomo was indicating, and Professor Silva. Just I wanted really to quickly to introduce, Mr. Chair, the co-organizer with the South Center of this webinar and this event. And of course, just also on behalf of President Obasanjo, who, as you know, the president of the board, the CODA's board, to continue our commitment, in fact, to work closely together with the South Center to support, in fact, African countries on the issue of fiscal policies, resource mobilization, and helping, in fact, African countries to raise more resources and to strengthen their position, in fact, in the global arena on the negotiation on the reforms of the financial and economic system. So thank you again, Mr. Chair. Thank you, colleagues. And of course, our technical papers are available on CODA's website. And of course, we are here to continue our work and hopefully to take forward the recommendation of this important webinar and important discussion together with our colleagues and our partner in the South Center. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks to you, and I'm sorry for delaying your presentation. Thank you for presenting the excellent work that you are doing. And certainly the South Center is very much interested in continue this very productive cooperation. So we'll be there in order to cooperate. You are doing an excellent work, and we hope to be able to further contribute to this work that you are doing. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair,
for your presentation and the excellent work that you are doing. So now we have the last speaker, who is Hanan Morsi. He is the African Development Bank Director of Macroeconomic Policy.
Yes. Hello. Hi. Good afternoon,
Ah,
everyone.
no, so she, eh? So welcome, huh? So
Thank you.
welcome, Hannah Mosi. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to maybe take a step back to look at the big picture here, which is the fact that Africa's digital economy has grown rapidly across all sectors, that the digital economy provides opportunities for the continent to improve service delivery, increase transparency and accountability, and also that the fact that we had the COVID-19 actually further accelerating this use of digital technologies across Africa. So this is basically, provides all these developments provide opportunities for African governments to increase mobilization of government revenues. The rapid growth in digital economies provide an opportunity to increase revenue collection, expand tax base of governments, and including through taxing the digital economy, and can be a way to enhance the efficiency of the tax collection. However, this also, all these developments also not only provide opportunities, but also pose challenges and constraints. And perhaps, and I feel like this is an area that has not been, discussed or brought in the discussion so far sufficiently. The fact that, the current advances in digital economies, this, basically provide constraints on the taxation, how to tax digital economies in the continent. So first, by allowing businesses to operate remotely without physical presence, that render the traditional notion of permanent establishment, which is has been the traditionally how tax authorities relies on, becomes inapplicable. This poses significant challenges for tax collection and to basically, determine the right of a country to tax a foreign business generating activities that is connected within its border. This also, the growth in the sophistication of ICTs and information technology companies have permitted companies that are in the digital economies to harvest data and information. Their profit does not only come from their sales. There are very valuable components of how they make profits that is very difficult to track, monitor, and then tax or benefit from in terms of government revenues. So this will be a key issues like the rethinking of how the tax policy is done, not only to tax. Taxing the revenues is just one component. There is a lot more money that is made by actually how this information is collected and used, far more than the actual revenues. So how this can actually be used and how can this be in a way tracked, quantified, and then translated into revenues will be key. Also, that raises issues on how do we attribute value to the data generated or gathered by online platforms? How do we characterize a person or an entity supply of data in such transaction? Is it a free supply of a good, a barter transaction? All these are really like fundamental issues in how we think about the tax policy. Then there are also the issue of the uncertainties about the characterization of income derived from new business models in the digital economy. Usually this is done by categorizing income to determine the rate and means of taxation. But with the digitalization, it becomes difficult to clearly distinguish some types of income especially among royalties, service fees, business profits, and therefore determine the appropriate tax regime to apply. Examples of this can include the case of payments for cloud computing services, rental of cloud space, or other technical services, which is unclear whether the payment is for royalties, service fees, or business profits. So these are really some of the key challenges that will be facing policymakers when we deal with all these developments in the global economies and in Africa. And here, for the African countries to get a fair share of the booming digital economies, it's important that the continent takes an active role in the current global efforts and discussions, which is actually exactly what this forum and today's discussion is about. And for the voices to be heard, but that also means that the continent has to speak in a collective voice for the continent to have a bigger weight at the table in these discussions. And also, the more that developing countries can come to some agreements in terms of what need to be done, the higher the chances are in influencing the direction. So this will be, of course, key, but also I think there is a need to go beyond even the current proposal in terms of the need to adopt at an African level a more comprehensive solution that addresses the challenges and limitations of digital taxation, as I had mentioned before. For instance, the African countries can leverage the implementation of the African Continental Trade Agreement to strengthen collaboration and develop unified digital tax regime as one way to increase compliance. And without a unified tax regime, digital economy tax regimes at a country level could easily be used to evade the large digital economy marketplace. So that would be really important, but I think also another issue that we need to be conscious of is for African governments to benefit from at the revenue side, there are a lot of work that need to be done at the capacity level, because the monitoring, the ability to enforce compliance and all this need a lot more sophisticated skills than the traditional capacities that existed. And I think we cannot underestimate. So we will have to have parallel tracks. Yes, we need to have a voice at the table, but if we're not able to, when even what we want is implemented, to have the capacity to actually benefit from it in terms of administration and collection, that wouldn't help. So I think in parallel, there is a need to really develop that capacity, tax authority capacity for all these new modalities, and how this can be really integrated to both enhance the tax administration, collection efficiency will be key. Especially, moving in this, this will be increasingly the model going forward with increased digitalization. And
Dr. Morsi, I'm very sorry, but we are running late. If you can just wrap up.
Sure. So for me, I think what we need to be conscious of is not just about, yes, and I agree with all colleagues, it's about what we can, the common voice in how to deal with the current proposals, but a lot need to be done in terms of building capacity and rethinking the tax policies within the continent. So I'll end with that.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Morsi, for these comments, for indicating the complexity of taxing in the context of digital economy. Also the need to improve capacity building and to have a collective voice. I think all these are very welcome comments. So please stay for the session of question and answer. So we move now. I think I think the speakers they have been extremely very well presented contributions, and we have learned a lot from them about the current situation and alternatives that may be proposed. So now we move to another segment of this session, and these are the interventions by the collaborator organizations. So I will request to be brief because we are running out of time. I will request our dear Yeah, I think my connection was lost. So I was requesting now the intervention from the collaborator organization. I was asking Tax Justice Network, represented by Liz Nelson, to make a 4-minute statement.
Yes, thank you. So good afternoon, good morning, good evening, and thank you both actually to CODA and the South Centre for the initiative and the opportunity to collaborate. So I think many of you know that the heart of our work is understanding effective taxation and how it's crucial to the progressive achievement of human rights. The ongoing bias and failures of the international tax system and rules and cooperation result in systemic inequalities in taxing rights between countries. Each year, the State of Tax Justice report, co-published with the Global Alliance for Tax Justice and with Public Services International, confirms that lower income countries lose a greater share of their current tax revenues to cross-border tax abuse. The evidence confirms too that the founding OECD member countries and their dependent territories are responsible for the great majority of the tax losses suffered. The State of Tax Justice report reveals global revenue losses of $483 billion US, enough to pay for everyone in the world to be vaccinated against COVID 3 times over. The greatest share by far is due to corporate tax abuse by the largest multinational companies, some $312 billion US. And the culprits, if you like, the UK spider's web, together with the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Switzerland, are responsible for over half of these tax losses. OECD members are also the biggest losers in absolute dollar terms, and hence the continuing interest in curbing tax abuse. But in relative terms, the OECD countries' losses may amount to just a few % of their public health budgets. I'm consciously taking some of my intervention now that others may have covered. But I would say that the resulting damage to human rights and well-being is dramatic. Every year, 17 million more people could benefit from clean water and 34 million from basic sanitation if revenue losses due to global tax abuse were reversed. These are fundamental human rights and are essential for survival. The need to challenge these dramatic tax losses and the underpinning inequalities in taxing rights is clear. So something very briefly about the OECD proposals, about the loss of ambition and fairness. People have talked, in detail about more the technical aspects. So I'd say that for Pillar 1 only goes beyond the arm's length principle to the necessary unitary tax approach for just a sliver of the profits of only 100 multinationals. Pillar 2 does set a global minimum rate, but so low at 15% that the incentives to shift profit from African countries with statutory rates of 25 to 35% will remain substantial. Only the comprehensive signature and ratification of multilateral instruments could ensure some share for other countries of operation, but it is unclear what incentives there are for either headquarter countries or corporate tax havens in the OECD to sign such an instrument. And those same havens are working hard with corporate lobbyists to make the carve-outs as big as possible, so additional revenues are as small as possible. The proposals will also place a low maximum on the rates of withholding taxes, as Professor Picciotto pointed out. So threats to any future improvement, above all, perhaps the proposal offers under the minimum tax such a disproportionate share of revenues to the US and a few other major economies compared to a fair approach like our Meta proposal, for example, that any future reform may simply become impossible. I think our kind of final message would be, or really the key message is here, is about not signing a blank check. There is at present no OECD evaluation that's either public or private of the costs and the benefits of the still evolving proposals. Without full access to country by country reporting data or to the final proposals, most governments cannot conduct satisfactory analysis themselves. In the clearest cases, such as Nigeria, the revenue losses from giving up unilateral measures are known and substantial, while any gains from the proposals are highly uncertain, but likely to be small. We really welcome Dr. Correa's announcement. The South Centre and CODA will call for research on the costs and benefits of the OECD deal. There remains the issue that anyone doing this independently, including us, will be denied access probably to OECD data, but it's still really important that we do that. And for
Liz,
most countries—
I'm very sorry, Liz, if you can just, sorry for interrupting you, but we are really late.
I'll make two very brief points. First being that governments heeding their obligations to economic and social rights and their commitment to achieving greater equality should be exceedingly cautious about going beyond the entirely non-binding commitment of the inclusive framework. The OECD multilateral instruments will be fully binding. At a minimum, governments and civil society should ensure that there is full public and parliamentary scrutiny of possible costs and benefits before any such commitment is made. I'll leave it there.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your statement and for your advice on these issues. So we move now to the Pan-African Lawyers Union, Donald Dia.
Thank you very much, Dr. Correa. On behalf of the Pan-African Lawyers Union, just like to make this point, that we endorse the continuum of policy and legal instruments that have been adopted by the African Union and its 55 member states. And we advocate that this should be seen as forming part of an evolving whole. And this includes the UN Sustainable Development Goals and also the African Union Agenda 2063. This include, as has been mentioned severally, the AU Assembly Declaration on Illicit Financial Flows of January 2015, which emanated from the report of the high-level panel on illicit financial flows from Africa that was led by His Excellency President Thabo Mbeki. These include the Addis Ababa Action Agenda on Financing for Development, the FFD of July 2015. This includes the AU Assembly Declaration on Anti-Corruption, the Nouakchott Declaration that was adopted in July 2018 during the AU Year of Anti-Corruption. This includes the Common African Position on Asset Recovery, that was adopted last year in February 2020 by the 33rd Assembly of the AU. And of course, this also includes, to bear in mind, the report and the recommendations published in February 2021 of the United Nations High-Level Panel on International Financial Accountability, Transparency and Integrity for Achieving the 2030 Agenda, the UN FACTI. And the point that we make is that with regard to the AU Agenda 2063, the two AU Assembly declarations and the Common African Position on Asset Recovery, these form the basis of African policy and law on issues of taxation. And it is important to remind, especially African negotiators, that these form the least common denominator in their negotiations. Of course, they should also bear in mind the human and people's rights obligations under the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, which Liz Nelson has just spoke about. So we reiterate that we endorse these assembly decisions. We endorse UN FACTI. We also endorse the United Nations Committee of Experts on International Cooperation in Tax Matters, especially its Articles 12A and 12B that have been referred to. We also endorse recent publications of the South Center and of ICRICT, the International Commission for the Reform of International Corporate Taxation in this regard. PALU is playing its part and will continue to play its part in the practical recommendations, especially of the AU Assembly decisions at national levels, continental levels, and global levels. And prominently working through the consortium to stem illicit financial flows from Africa, chaired by President Becky, who was appointed by the January 2015 AU Assembly decision to implement the recommendations of his report. Also working with the IFFs working group, which is a technical working arm of the consortium. We'll continue working on this with the Stop the Bleeding Consortium, which is a collective of 7 Pan-African civil society organizations working towards economic justice, good economic governance, and a just international economic order in which international financial architecture works for everyone and not just for the powerful states of the global north. And also we'll continue working through the Financial Transparency Coalition, which is a collective of 12 civil society organizations from the global north and global south, working on these issues. And I just like to highlight that in working on these campaigns, we need to be conscious that several issues are interconnected and that we must consciously connect the agendas and connect the struggles. And these include IFFs, especially the tax element, but these also include debt, and these also include trade, especially for us now in the context of the African continental free trade area. 2 things. While it is a currently obtaining position, we do not take it as a given that the world will always have to negotiate global taxation matters under the OECD and its inclusive framework. We continue to assert that the appropriate place to negotiate global taxation matters is the United Nations, and that the UN Tax Committee ought to be upgraded into an intergovernmental body for this purpose. We also do not take it as a given that the recent OECD decision is a fait accompli and can neither be rejected nor renegotiated. We applaud the governments that have held back, such as Kenya, Nigeria, Pakistan. And we also encourage the citizens and also the parliaments of African countries and other global South countries that have endorsed this OECD decision framework to revisit this endorsement at the point of ratification by national parliaments and to reserve the right to reject it or to force a revision or a negotiation. On our part, in the course of 2021, working with our partners, especially the Stop the Bleeding Consortium, we will work towards a robust debate on these issues at the Pan-African Parliament, which is our global parliament, and also consistent engagement with the African Union's Specialized Technical Committee on Finance, Monetary Affairs, Economic Planning and Integration, which is the Continental Ministerial Committee on Finance and the Economy. And we will also continue to confront—
Donald, I'm very sorry to interrupt, but we are late. If you can just
okay.
wrap up in 1 minute.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much. I'll wrap up in 1 minute. That we encourage African states to quickly ratify the legal instruments that set up the envisaged African financial architecture, because this will be a substantial boost to shoring up fiscal policy in Africa. This includes the treaties that set up the African Development Bank, the African Central Bank, the African Monetary Fund, and the African Monetary Institute. So in our view, this will really show up African fiscal policy. Thank you very much for your indulgence, Chair.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your views. This excellent presentation. So we move now to the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. Is Caroline Othing? Caroline?
Yes, thank you very much. And a huge thank you to the organizers of this session. The Global Alliance itself is a global coalition in the tax justice movement, and we campaign for progressive and redistributive taxation systems for a transparent, inclusive, and representative global tax governance internationally. The Global Alliance for Tax Justice and many in the global tax justice movement were critical and continue to be critical regarding the leadership role of the OECD, which is a club of the rich, to reform international tax rules. To give its leadership the veil of legitimacy, it created an inclusive framework of which has so far barely gone beyond rubber stamping the G7 deal of the rich. The framework always accommodates the deal of the G7, such as the one on a global minimum corporate tax rate of 15%, and disregards the suggestions, proposals, and reservations that a number of developing countries have put forward throughout many years of work. The solutions do not address the root causes of the current practices and rules that incentivize profit shifting and facilitate tax dodging with impunity. Limiting the scope of the OECD Pillar 1 solution to 100 or so multinational corporations really will not enable developing countries to raise more tax revenue from all multinational corporations. The agreed global minimum tax rate of 15% in two is lower than the world corporate income tax rate average of approximately 25% and closer to the 12.5% proposed by some low or no tax jurisdictions. Setting the big group of developing countries who have much higher statutory corporate tax rates, instead of stopping the tax to the race to the bottom tax competition, this low rate will put countries with a higher corporate income tax rate into a race to the minimum. In addition, as proposed by the OECD Pillar 2, would give the great majority of new revenues to the OECD headquarters countries of multinationals, instead of the lower income countries that lose the interest and the highest share of their tax revenues due to the failures of the current rules. And far from ensuring the taxing rights of developing countries, the solutions really will limit the right to tax of source countries to a small proportion of multinational corporations' profits and entrench taxing rights to headquarter countries over global profits. The institutional arrangement in which these solutions are being negotiated really lacks legitimacy, transparency, and accountability. The negotiations behind closed doors expose developing countries' representatives to political pressures and manipulation to agree to the deal of the rich. And therefore, a solution agreed in a politically biased and opaque process outside of the UN system and the related accountable country representation cannot have the legitimacy to be a binding international agreement. A fair global deal is only possible in an open, fully inclusive, and transparent intergovernmental process in which the public and civil society can hold negotiators to account for proposals and decisions, and in which the draft agreements are open to public scrutiny. And we believe that such a process is only possible within the framework of a UN-based intergovernmental negotiation in which countries can participate as equals. And so we reiterate our call for the establishment of a universal intergovernmental UN tax commission and negotiating at a UN tax convention to comprehensively address these tax havens, tax abuse by multinational corporations, and other illicit financial flows. We call upon countries to overcome the blockage to bring reform of international tax rules into the UN system and to work together for a truly inclusive and transparent negotiation process. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for presenting your concerns about the process and your views, how it can be improved. Thank you for this presentation. So we move now to the Collective for the Renewal of Africa, Ndongo Sila. Are you there? Collective of Africa.
Very much. On behalf of the Collective for the Renewal of Africa, I would like to thank the Coalition for Dialogue for having invited us to such an important gathering. This African Policy Forum on Fiscal Issues is a timely and critical initiative that we highly welcome. As CODA, we believe that the African continent development should be based on domestic resource mobilization, that is the mobilization of domestic financial resources, as well as the mobilization of domestic real resources, that is African labor resources, technologies, intermediate goods, and so on. As a rule, discussions on domestic resource mobilization in Africa tend to focus solely on the financial aspect. This focus is important as we know how illicit financial flows and critically needed resources. CODA welcomes the discussion on this issue and supports the research and policy efforts made by the African Union, CODA, and civil society organizations worldwide to stem illicit financial flows and to bring forward a fairer international taxing environment. Illicit financial flows, to the extent that they often mean a loss of foreign currency, implies, first of all, an outflow of real resources without any counterpart in terms of foreign earnings accruing to them. This situation reduces the space for potential non-inflationary spending by the states. Illicit financial flows have other negative outcomes that are generally downplayed, such as the depreciation of foreign exchange rates, which implies in turn that foreigners can buy cheaply goods, services, and labor of African countries. In other words, illicit as well as licit outflows of economic surplus weaken the continent's terms of trade. Given these outcomes, as CODA, we can only welcome the insightful discussions we are having today about taxing rights. As CODA, we would, however, recommend that the discussion on the domestic mobilization of financial resources be made in tandem with the mobilization of real resources. When we say real resources, we mean land, labor, technologies, and so on. Africa is a continent facing many challenges. One of them is the need to create millions of decent jobs annually for a growing and dynamic labor force. Creating jobs is a vital aspect of domestic resource mobilization. Any genuine strategy for domestic resource mobilization must factor in the need to mobilize the labor force, how a relatively most abundant resource in productive economic endeavors. As CODA, we would also like the members of this platform to revisit the narrative about fiscal space. In our current international monetary system, the concept of different than before. State spending capacity is not limited by their tax income. Also, the latter is important. Fiscal space in our current monetary system is first of all defined by real resources that each government can command in its own currency. Whatever is feasible, particularly at the level, can be financed in local currency without the financing being constrained by the level of tax income or national savings. Time is limited to not be discussed separately from monetary issues. So we hope as CODA that this forum will allow a space to exchange on how African countries can strengthen their monetary fiscal nexus in a way that helps them achieve more financial sovereignty through an increase in the government's capacity to spend in a non-inflationary way. As CORA, we believe that the commendable efforts currently being made to retain the economic surplus that evades the continent so illicit, as well as mobilize the continent's domestic real resources through a stronger and more functional fiscal model. These are some initial thoughts from us. Thank you for your attention.
Hello, sorry, we seem to have lost Dr. Correa again. So until he comes back, can we have the last intervention by the African Center for Tax and Governance, Mustafa Ndajiwo, the Executive Director. Mustafa, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Thank you, CODA and the South Center for organizing such an important meeting. We are truly honored to be collaborators. The African Center for Tax and Governance is focused on promoting equitable taxation in Africa. A lot has been said already, particularly on the technicalities of the issue. So I won't be speaking on those. But I mean, flowing from what has been said, it is obvious that the global processes to address the challenges of the global tax system is fairly unequal and unfair to African countries. This is both in terms of the content of the proposals, the implications, and the process of representation and participation of African countries. This presents a lot of risks for African countries, particularly in terms of funding the SDGs. As far as we're concerned, the issue is not only technical, as has been mentioned by previous speakers, but largely a political issue. It is obvious that there's currently no viable political framework to champion Africa's interests, unlike what you have in the global north, looking at the likes of the OECD, G7, and strong economies like the United States. It is our hope that the African Fiscal Policy Forum will herald new opportunities to address these inequalities. At this stage, it is important for African countries that have endorsed this deal to review their decisions and strongly consider either pulling out or to renegotiate a fairer deal. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for presentation. I'm sorry I was disconnected again for a minute. So now we have then finished this session with intervention by collaborating organizations. We may have a few minutes for open discussions. I haven't seen really too many. I haven't seen any question on the Q and answer. If there is any question, I've seen Irene. Okay, yes, Irene.
Yes,
please.
thank you very much. Thank you very much for moderating this. I just wanted to respond on the question that you put to me. I got dropped, so I wasn't able to do it. Professor Saul P. Kyoto has talked about some of the specific technical ways forward that countries can take, and these are relevant not just for African countries, but also for other developing countries, in terms of taking up some of the proposals coming out of the UN Tax Committee or unilateral measures on digital service taxes and so on. I wanted to add to that. I think the first important step for all countries is to just reassess the purpose of the engagement in a process such as the OECD best process. That ultimately, what countries are looking for is increase in their taxing rights, and we have seen the outcome of that is that because of the prioritization of home countries' taxing rights, of headquarters countries' taxing rights,
the host countries, the source countries, taxing rights are deprioritized. So that objective is not achieved, largely because of the structure of the economy and the relationship between jurisdictions in the global south, where most of the multinational corporations that engage in cross-border trade are not headquartered. So that is one very important thing. So it's important for countries to assess clearly what are the outcomes they were looking for, and what are the red lines for taking up, for signing up or ratifying the document eventually legally. And that there's also a need for them to do this based on an assessment, because at the end of the day, what countries will be looking for is increased revenues. So to do that assessment with all the limitations that Liz and others have talked about, and which I think the South Center is moving to support with other organizations, a real assessment of the costs and benefits involved, which looks both at the revenue, the increase or losses of revenues, but also looks at the reduction or expansion of fiscal sovereignty. Because taxation is a sovereign right. When countries enter into such agreements, they are giving up rights that they already have to tax. So what will be the implications for their future position with relation to the OECD deal? The challenge will be around unilateral measures and the ability to do that, but also issues relating to arbitration and the removal of power, of authority, of domestic courts to handle disputes. That's also a major issue, given the opacity and the imbalance within in the experience that countries have had around international arbitration. So there's a need to actually do cost-benefit analysis. And so against that, what has been already proposed, and just want to emphasize, is the need for collective action, because this is really a power issue. It's about economic power, political power at a global level that then results in these unequal rights between countries, the unequal taxing rights. So the only way forward really for countries is to work collectively. For African countries, the AU needs to come out much more strongly to coordinate African Union members, and then also global coordination between the different regions. So between Africa, Asia, and Latin America, it is really important, through supportive organizations such as the South Center that are already engaging, with G77. And as many colleagues have already said, ultimately, the forum within which this happens will matter, and has been demonstrated by the BEPS deal. It really matters. So follow up on the recent resolution that was proposed, that was discussed at the UN General Assembly, that was proposed by the G77. Follow up to ensure that the UN picks up the recommendations of FACTI and of other bodies will be critical to push for the UN to have this space. This is going to be a political fight, as has been said by many people, and there's a history to this. So it therefore also means that the connection, the coordination across regions is important, but between the policymakers, political leaders, and the technical institutions, including non-governmental organizations, so that you have both technical competence in the discussions and the negotiations, as well as political will behind it. So, and this has already happened in spaces like the WTO in Geneva. So we do not need to reinvent the wheel. African governments, developing country governments, need to adopt the kind of approach that they've taken up in the WTO. The way in which our missions in Geneva engage collaboratively on this and support their capitals, or work very closely with their capitals in that collective framework of developing countries. This needs to be transferred into the tax arena as well.
Thank you very much for these comments. Well, certainly assessment, a decision which is based on an informed and knowledge on what the benefits of or lack of benefits of these solutions would be. It's important that you have stressed again the sovereign rights, so there is no need to give up the sovereign rights, and in particular the unilateral measures that can be adopted. That's an important point. They need to have a collective action, and the South Center certainly is trying to do that, to have a collective action from developing countries, from the 3 continents. And you also mentioned the forum matters, and that's important that developing countries continue to fight for changing the forum in which these processes takes place. So thank you very much again for these comments. I wonder whether there is another question. So, well, if not, then let us move to the last segment of this session. I'm very sorry for delay in this last part of the session, which is the wrap-up and closing remarks by His Excellency Maxwell Mexalamba, former Minister of Finance of the Republic of Malawi and member of the CODA Technical Committee on Domestic Resource Mobilization. So before I give the floor to you, sir, let me thank the speakers, let me thank the participants on behalf of the South Center. We continue to work together to ensure that the African countries make the right decisions in the light of the current proposals, and they can assert their taxing rights as this should be the case, in particular in the context of digital economy. So thank you very much. And then the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair of this panel. And let me congratulate you on the successful deliberations during the panel. I must say that the interventions from the panelists were quite powerful, rich, thought-provoking, as well as enlightening during this first African Fiscal Forum, which was focusing on inequalities in taxing rice. I have been given this role that I basically, highlight some of the observations, comments and recommendations going forward. I'll try to do that, and I take it also that the Secretariat has been doing its work, and which means that I think more information will be provided at an appropriate time. But suffice to say that it has been, highlighted that, for Africa to make progress, we need to have adequate, resources, and mobilizing these resources would have likely to depend on domestic resources, which will have to be at the center of our strategy. And of course, in view of the importance of corporate tax in contributing to fiscal revenues in Africa, improving efficiency and capacity of company tax collection becomes critical. But then, despite the tax concessions and other incentives to attract multinational corporations, illicit financial flows from Africa continue to remain high. These have been through a number of channels, including misinvoicing, tax avoidance, as well as tax evasion. And there are figures that have been presented here, including in your own intervention, Chair, regarding the increase in illicit financial flows from around 50 billion when the report of the Mbeki high-level panel was actually done to currently a figure of close to 90 billion in 2020, an increase of some 77% over a 5-year period. And hence the importance of stemming illicit financial flows has been highlighted. And in this regard as well, the work of the Mbeki high-level panel has been, commended, including the adoption of the special declaration of the AU on the illicit financial flows, but also the fact that these same issues have been taken up at the global level, including by the UN FACT panel. It has been emphasized that the issue of illicit financial flows is not only an African problem, but I think in our context, the magnitude is quite high. In this context, the forum has noted the existence of global processes, including the OECD G20 inclusive framework on BEPS, with focus on the two pillars. Pillar one, which provides taxing rights to market jurisdictions on part of residual profits and by multinationals, corporations, as well as pillar two, which has set a global minimum tax rate. However, the forum does not view the OECD G20 inclusive framework on BEPS as of benefit to African countries and more broadly developing countries, although most of them have actually signed the agreement. The framework is seen to be unfair and resulting in a limited revenue gains and the giving up of unilateral tax measures. In the case of Pillar 1, for example, a few multinational corporations will be covered given the annual global turnover of more than 20 billion US dollars. But also, when you look at the global minimum tax of 15%, it has been highlighted that, for a number of our countries in Africa, but also in the developing, countries, a figure of about 25–30% would have been more beneficial to our, countries. Further, within the current international tax regime, and in the case of MNCs, payment of taxes is not guaranteed where value is created owing to international tax competition or race to the bottom, in addition to deployment of sophisticated tax planning and tax avoidance techniques by the multinational corporations. And of course, there's been also mention of the opacity of the tax havens. There are also concerns regarding the need to go to international arbitration for dispute resolutions for several reasons, including that several African countries and indeed developing countries may not have the capacity to engage in international arbitration. Further, there are concerns that the two-pillar solution under the OECD G20 inclusive framework ignored the demands of the developing countries during the negotiations, and the solution was designed by the global north to shield digitalized companies from taxation by the global south. Concerns therefore have been expressed regarding Africa's participation and representation in the negotiations. There's been mention of only 4 countries in Africa, for example, Nigeria, South Africa, Cote d'Ivoire, and Senegal, which were in the steering committee. And of course, we also have Zambia, which joined later on, but basically it's been those 4. And then when it came to active participation in the negotiations, only Nigeria and South Africa have been there. And I think another issue that also needs to be mentioned is the fact that this participation of these countries have been at the technical level and not at the political level, and I think resulting in compromise level of engagement. I must say the forum did welcome, that's what I got, the fact that Nigeria and Kenya did not sign the international tax framework as proposed by the OECD G20 inclusive framework, given that it will have detrimental effects on the future of Africa's revenue and make it difficult for the continent to achieve the sustainable development goals. On the other hand, African countries that have endorsed the OECD G20 inclusive framework during the discussions have been called upon to reconsider their position. But also, the Pakistan and Sri Lanka have been highlighted as some of those countries that did not endorse the framework. Besides the OECD G20 inclusive framework on BEPS, the forum considered the UN Fact Panel recommendations, including Article 12B of the United Nations Model Tax Convention, aimed at reforming and redesigning the global architecture to foster financial accountability and integrity. The forum was of the view that the UN process is more inclusive and relevant to the needs of Africa and more broadly the global South than the OECD G20 inclusive framework on base erosion. In this regard, having an intergovernmental tax body at the UN, where such negotiations should be taking place on equal footing, as recommended by the UN Fact Panel, may also be something that could be considered. Technical work, of course, could be carried out by the IMF. Besides existing institutional architecture, there's also been mention of lack of coordination between the various other bodies that have been participating in these discussions. Mention was made of the fact that the OECD G20 framework, when it comes to accountability, it's basically to the G7, OECD, and G20, and that's why also it becomes not so good for us. Therefore, the need for Africa to have a coordinated and coherent approach in these global processes to curb illicit financial flows from Africa, and ensuring that the processes are inclusive and address the peculiarities of African countries will be quite important going forward. And within this context, we could also look at South-South cooperation. That might be of help. And then I think what also saw coming out was that the forum was commending the work of the high-level panel on illicit financial flows chaired by President Mbeki, as well as recommending the need for implementation of the recommendations at the country, regional, as well as global levels. And finally, I think there's been a recommendation going to Coalition for Dialogue on Africa and South Center for having co-organized the holding of this first African Fiscal Forum with focus on inequalities in taxing rights, given that inequalities in taxing rights have long existed in international standards, and that digitalization of the economy has made it difficult for the developing countries to tax highly digitalized companies. And therefore, I think what I would like to say is that in conclusion, on behalf of the Coalition for Dialogue on Africa, the Coalition for Dialogue on Africa Technical Committee on Domestic Resources Mobilization, and of course, Chair, if you agree with me as Executive Director, also on behalf of the South Center, I would like to thank the panelists and all participants for their active engagement during the discussion. I would also like to thank the co-organizers, the CODA Secretariat and the South Center, and their also cooperating partners for the excellent collaboration in organizing this very successful first African Fiscal Forum. And of course, I think you did excellent work, Chair, in facilitating these discussions. I think the discussions were deep, again, because of your questions, follow-up questions, which was quite helpful, and would like to thank you sincerely for having, professionally facilitated the panel discussions. All I can do now is just to wish you all happy holidays and happy New Year. And it is now my honor and privilege to declare this first African Fiscal Forum closed. But I know there might be, maybe the Secretariat or yourself may want to make some final remarks. I thank you for your kind attention.
Well, thanks a lot. It has been such a comprehensive and excellent conclusion that there is nothing that I could add. Just to thank again the possibility to cooperate with CODA. We'll continue to do this. I think it has been a very successful forum. We hope that we can further work and consider the options that have been presented for the African countries and other developing countries. So thank you very much again. It really has been a fantastic forum, and we hope to continue working together. So as it was noted, we need to have collective action in order to change things, to change the status quo. We need to work together. So thank you very much again to all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Goodbye. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Prof. Correa. Thank you for an excellent job.
Thank you very much. Thanks to you.
There's a lot to be done from now.
Yeah, it has been an excellent.
Yeah,
excellent
as we say around here, a luta continua.
Yeah.
Taxing rights has been with us, it will remain with us.
Okay, all right. All the best.
Thank you very much. Yes.